Reuten. Geert? This one seems to work. I don't know about that one.
Okay. For socialists, the resolution of unemployment must be priority one, now and always. First of all, inherently because of the unemployed, and secondly also as a matter of power position of labor in general. Sadly, we know it's not the priority of the economic policy of the right and for vested powers. Instead, that policy is a combination of first the crisis opportunity to slim the state, and second the crisis opportunity to ruin the labor market. And so it also there is some stupidity about it, because a depression is also not in the interests of capital. In this brief introduction, I focus first on the background of the crisis and next on current problems of the Eurozone countries. In my view, the current crisis is rooted in a structural change of the rate of surplus value from the early 1980s. I focus on the realization of surplus value, retained profits, distributed profits and interest, and this realization requires, of course, a concomitant production of surplus value. From the early 1980s, we see on these two graphs an increasing share of surplus value and GDP in both the EU and the USA. The enduring vast unemployment following on from the 1981-82 recession shifted the capital-labor power relation such that the wages increase could continuously be kept below labor productivity increase. Such vast wages share decrease and uncompensated, a concomitant consumption decrease would give rise to a stagnation. In fact, however, we have seen a 25 years postponement of this stagnation. At first because of decreased savings out of wages, which is advantageous for corporations, and next because of the reverse, namely banks finance consumption beyond wages, especially via mortgages. And their sectorization revolved this in an apparently continuous constellation. I skipped the details about banks' balance sheets and interbank problems. Of course, these debts have to be repaid at some point in the future out of wages. And Fotis Lisandro has aptly called this the colonization of the future. Even apart from this, the weak balances of banks do not allow for the continuation. In conclusion on this point, the stagnation postponed is now in state of actualization with even depression-like traits. This is the main problem, one that the EU shares with the USA. And I now go into some additional European Union problems, especially of the Eurozone area, of the Eurozone. Vast productivity differences would seem incompatible with a monetary union. This is especially so when the amalgamate of states does not operate as a constellation showing solidarity. In fact, the euro area is dominated by the interests of large corporations, including banks, governed by fundamental mutual distrust between states, and governed by national self-interests, in which northern states such as Germany and its vassal state, the Netherlands, are actually very effective. In brief, it is not a union, but a blending of separate interests. I focus on the 12 early Euro countries, but neglect Luxembourg. Let's first look at monetary productivity differences on a per hour basis. Comparing the start of the monetary union in 1999 with 2011, we see some changes in relative productivity levels. Though the differences of the bottom with the top is still very big, a factor 3, and that is as big as it was at the start. Next, we compare differences in macro monetary rates of surplus value, or perhaps a proxy thereof. This graph shows the start of the monetary union in 1999 with 2000. Sorry. This graph shows that comparing rates of surplus value, Germany is a middle country in this respect, just above Portugal and just below Greece. However, comparing these rates of surplus value over time between countries is tricky because of possible non-parallel changes of the numerator and denominator. And the next graph shows the composition, that is the growth of profits and wages between 1999 and 2012. On the left-hand graph, we see Germany's relative moderate surplus increase. That's compared to the other countries. Remarkable is also that the increase for Spain and Ireland on the outer right. And on the right-hand graph, we see on the outer left the result of the German workers' bargaining. See again Spain and Ireland on the outer right. These two, the country-wise differences in productivity and rates of surplus value are reflected in the balance of net exports. Notice that it is not merely unit wage costs that are important here, but also profits. And when we add to these net exports the net income and net capital transfers, we get to the net lending and net borrowing positions of the Euro countries. And these are shown in graph, in the next graph. In the 10 years prior to Euro, the blue blocks here, Germany was on average close to zero. Portugal ran a 3.5% deficit and Greece a 0.5% deficit. In the first 10 Euro years, Greater Deutschland came into existence. The 5 countries making it up started building up enormous external surpluses, with France on the edge. And Greater Greece built up vast deficits. In the next graph, we see this depicted in amounts of billion euros. See first on the left the total surplus sum for these countries together. And in amounts we see the domination of Germany, followed by its main vassal, the Netherlands. We see that Spain built up, and in these years built up an additional 600 billion, and Greece one of 280 billion debt. The euro is so in the interest of Greater Germany, mainly. The next two figures show schematically the interaction with the financial system. Figure 6 shows the net exports going from north to south, and the red arrow shows that northern banks and other financial institutions cover this by lending to the south that so accumulates debt. Then when southern banks got into trouble, the assets of the northern banks were affected when these got into trouble too. And the next figure, where the blue arrows are added to the previous figure, shows the EFSF and ESM solution. These are funds from and guaranteed by the Euro states to the other ones, through which the banks are saved. Until now, at least, mid-2013, the northern states have not lost on this. However, the laborers of the southern countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and also Ireland, had to pay for it in terms of the condition of an austerity triangle and its downward spiral. The effect of it is that the external position of Greater Greece has been restored. See the orange blocks for 2013. The four countries just mentioned at the outer right of the graph are now close to current balance. And this is the effect of the huge wage cuts and the concomitant immobilization along with the unprecedented unemployment is enormous. I get to my last and concluding point. In an extended crisis as the current, recovery is not a matter of costs, but a matter of expenditure. Investment stagnates and hence employment stagnates. There are two possible cures. First, increasing government expenditure so that investment rises, but stupid EU rules for government budgets apparently prevent expansionary policy. However, the EU rules are only half of the story, because these very rules are, in many countries at least, used as a pretext for the reverse, that is, of austerity policy, which is, of course, aggravating. The second possible cure is that of substantial wage increases, so that consumption provides the impetus for investment and so employment. Indeed, if governments refuse to lead an expansion, labor must. This makes, first of all, sense as a crisis cure. However, and here comes my first point back in, it is also important for curing structural stagnation. I somewhat played out the North-South political sentiments of national self-interest. There is some material truth behind these, but predominantly the constellation is an across Euroland class matter. And recall the graphs on German and German profits and wages. The workers must unite. Referring back to the productivity differences and the balance of payments differences, the way to unite now is by country-wise differentiated wage increases instead of the current differentiated wage decreases. There is no solidarity between these European Euro-states. On the contrary. And therefore, we must organize our own solidarity.
Just you have a nice blue screen not to distract you.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you here. Apparently I'm the youngest participant in this roundtable, but I chose the most old school technique. I will provide you with plain words, no slides. Also, I'm a trained economist. I would like to bring in some political perspective on what's happening currently in the European Union. And as I come from Germany and the German Left Party, probably most people here would agree that I'm living at the heart of the beast. And what I'll be attempting to do is to provide you with some idea what currently is the German government doing, what its strategic approach is, what's the rationale behind its policy, if there is a rationale. And the second part will be devoted to giving you some rough ideas on the debates and even the conflicts on economic issues we had in the Left Party, because even here we have controversies on how to deal with the crisis. I guess you're all familiar with the broad story, the suggestion by radical economists that this crisis has been brought about on the one hand by the financial meltdown, but even by wage policy and the architecture of the Eurozone. Wage policy in Germany, where wage dumping has occurred, so wages did not rise fast enough with productivity and the target inflation rate of the central bank. And due to that, Germany accumulated, as Geert has shown, huge trade external surpluses, which caused rising private indebtedness in especially peripheral countries. The German Chancellor Merkel tried to interpret the whole story different. She said it's a crisis of state expenditure, so not enough fiscal discipline on behalf of other Eurozone member countries. That's certainly not true if you look, for example, to Spain or Ireland, which had very low debt to GDP ratios prior to the crisis. And they had to intervene in the crisis and, so to speak, socialized the private debts that had occurred even because of the German model of wage dumping. The conclusion sometimes drawn even in Germany is then that what Merkel is effectively doing, or what the German government is effectively doing, is that she's destroying Europe. She's destroying the European project. And that's certainly true. But probably much even worse, she's destroying the living conditions of wage earners across Europe, even in Germany, because people suffered there from wage dumping. However, the point I want to bring forward is that I think, even though this is true, still I think the strategy of the German government has profoundly changed after the crisis with respect to its perspective on European integration. So prior to the crisis, we had this whole discourse on economic governance, that you should coordinate wage developments and so on in Europe. And the German government usually refused. So this was basically a French concern, and the German government refused. However, if you listen carefully now to speeches given, for example, by the German Minister of Finance, he says, no, we need more European integration. He might even be pragmatic on issues such as Eurobonds or intervention by the central bank, but he says this has to come at the end of the process after structural reforms. So after labor has been weakened. It's some kind of in Germany there's a saying, Scheckbuch diplomacy, which means we provide you with assistance if you do what we want. However, I think this is an important point because we have to assess politically whether under the current conditions our call for, let's say, an improved European governance structure will lead to the desired results, or whether the German government is trying via European integration to increase its role across Europe. And I think that currently the latter is true, which is no argument against seeking a better architecture on the European-wide level, but we have to be aware that currently the German government is pursuing, contrary to the broad claim that it's somehow opposed or endangering only the European project, it's clearly pursuing a path of tighter European integration, however, on a neoliberal basis, on a basis of enforcing the wrong policies that have led to this crisis. So some people are even asking, isn't that a kind of irrational policy, even from the so-called German perspective? Usually my response is, who's Germany? Is it like in the interest of the broad majority of wage earners? Is it in the interest of export capital? However, some people, even in German left, have questioned whether this policy is not hurting German export capital itself, because with austerity you have also a decline of exports, German exports and so on. And I think this is a valid point, and this is also something that we try to confront the German government with. However, I don't think that this is a kind of irrational policy, or that it's purely ideologically based, or that there's no political strategy or interest attached to it. So my interpretation is that what the German government is trying to do is basically to create an extended workshop across Europe for the German export capital, which is increasingly diversifying its exports to China and other regions. This will certainly not make up for the geographical proximity of the European market. And since the role of the US is not anymore as it was prior to the crisis to recycle the surpluses of countries like Germany, this strategy might very well fail. And we see in Germany even now, sometimes it's portrayed in the press as if we would experience the German growth miracle or something like that. That's certainly not true. Even Germany is at the brink of a recession. And what is important to note, even Germany tries to portray itself as economic powerhouse. If you look at the whole period throughout European Monetary Union, growth rates in Germany have been very low. So my interpretation of things is that the German government is not so much interested into the macroeconomic performance or into the performance of the macroeconomy. It's more interested in the performance of certain sections of German capital, which is the export capital in Germany. And certainly it is true that, as you could even see on the slides, with the euro and in combination with this wage dumping, surpluses have expanded. However, one has to add, and this is very important for our analysis of, let's say, the future developments and even possibilities to reshape economic policies in Europe, one has to acknowledge that, technically speaking, the German economy was always very much focused on exports, not as much as today. Like the export share has dramatically increased from roughly 20% of GDP to now 50% of GDP, which is usually a value that you could observe in small, very open economies such as Switzerland or the Benelux countries. However, even after Second World War, like the German heavy industries, automotive industry, chemical industries, were always such that they depended on huge external markets, because they are heavy-scale industries with a lot of fixed costs, and you need to have international markets to be competitive. This is just to indicate that I'm a little bit skeptic whether just by changing the path of wage development in Germany, we will solve all structural problems across Europe, because I think even if we would correct wage policy in Germany, which certainly we have to do, not only for the sake of the European project, but even for the living conditions of workers, even then probably the challenge would remain. What would, for example, Greece export in such a situation, because we effectively destroyed the industries, and it needs time to rebuild these industries, and there are even path-dependent developments incurred. Once you have established a chemical industry, it's very hard to for a second country to establish its own industry. Politically, I think there's also a political rationale behind the strategy. So Germany, after the Second World War, was very much limited to its role as economic power, and it was greatly assisted even by the United States in regaining this role. So because of corporatist labor relations, Germany had very low inflation rates, so they established themselves as a niche currency across Europe. However, in political terms, Germany was not as powerful and always tried to bank on a multilateral strategy to pursue its own interests under the European umbrella. Now you can see slightly different developments. For example, if you look in the realm of foreign policy, if you look to the military interventions in Mali, in Libya, and Syria, Germany is not as closely aligned anymore with France on these matters. It's not because Germany is pursuing some peace-loving agenda, it is not intervening. It simply has other interests in this region and does not want to engage anymore in it. However, I think this is as well an indication that Germany is trying now to pursue a much more unilateral political agenda. However, it still does this for historical reasons via the European institutions. And hence, Germany, for example, there was an instance when there were concerns on the markets about Spain. And Germany very much wanted to force Spain to go under the umbrella of the European Stability Mechanism, because, and you could find that very, very irritating, because you think it's not in the interests of German policymakers to confront their own electorate with further bailout programs or something, but apparently they are interested in getting political influence and domination over the mechanism of the ESM and to dominate even national economic policies in other countries via these institutions. So I would like to use my statement here that we should open up the debate on what developments are likely with respect to the European institutions. How do we achieve these goals? Is it the right strategy to hope that closer European institutional cooperation will provide us with the checks and balances to mitigate the effects of the policies that Germany is pursuing? I also wanted to provide you with a few ideas on debates we had within the German left, but my time is running out, so I'll leave it for here and maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, we have done a lot of activism in Syriza in Greece, but most likely we'll become a government in a few months, so our perspective has changed a bit. So let me summarize what I'm planning to say. There are three questions. Sorry?
How you are planning to govern?
Well, that will be the third question. The first question is, what is the nature of the Greek crisis? B, the shock therapy, what's going on since 2010 with the famous Greek program, the Mnemonio? And C, what are the options for a left government if it comes into power? Let me start with the first question. What are the roots of the Greek problem? The Greek problem emerged in 2010 2009 because of the high public debt. That's the main idea behind the Greek crisis. In reality, the Greek public debt has its roots back in the 1980s, not in the era of the euro and the rest. In 1992, the Greek debt was at 120% of the GDP. In 2009 was 120% of GDP. And when the pneumonia will end up, and the IMF does the work that's been doing in Greece, the target is to be in 2020 to be 120% of our GDP. so as you realize, it can't be the main argument behind what's going on in Greece, the high Greek public debt. It is a problem, but it can't be the problem. Now, the Greek public debt was in the 1980s, became the big issue because in the 1980s we had, after the dictatorship, etc., we had for the first time a proper welfare state in Greece. So public expenditure came to the European average, 40-something% of this GDP. This was financed partly by taxes and partly by loans. So that's how it was created. Now, in the second era, it was sustained at this level, despite the fact that Greece was having a very high rate of growth between 1996 and 2008, probably one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Now, usually when you have such a high growth, public debt should go down, but it was kept at this level as the governments, because of the high rate of growth, and because of the era that I will explain in a minute, continue to keep public debt at a high rate rather than allowing to go down in relative terms. Now, the second element of this era of high growth was that the Greek economy, despite the fact that everybody thinks that has remained a state-owned economy, something of, the Greek economy during this period was adjusted with neoliberal policies at a record level, very well adjusted to what the neoliberal policies were saying at the time. And it did so, it adjusted to this globalization neoliberal theme. Between 1996 and 2004, Greece has the second highest record of privatizations in Europe, with the exception of Portugal. Portugal was even higher in privatizations. We practically privatized whatever was under state control, business, industries, etc., that were under state control back from the crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. We privatized all banks that were, had a huge state sector in the banking sector of, let's say, 60-70%. We privatized all the new projects in infrastructure, the Athens airport, the motorways, ports, and so on and so forth. So the idea that we did this. Second, we adjusted the whole system to the free flow of capital in and out, etc., etc. So we had a liberalization of economic policy. And at the same time, always between 1996 and 2008, the state retrieved from areas that was very active: industrial policy, regional policy, development banks, specialized development banks, agricultural banks, and so on and so forth. So the idea was the retreat of the state, putting the private banking sector as the major force to drive the economy and liberalize the economy. And Greece did all this kind of stuff, and at the same time, it expanded the Greek capital in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, specializing exactly to the sectors that the comparative advantage of Greece was all about, and that is shipping, tourism, banking, and construction. This had a direct effect on real production, agriculture and manufacturing, which obviously started to have a very negative effect of this huge transformation of the Greek economy. For obvious reasons. A, because we entered the euro, and the euro was central to this project because Greece is gaining its foreign exchange by 2/3 from tourism and shipping. It's 1/3 of the foreign exchange comes from exports. So the major shift was in this type of foreign exchange, which was very crucial, and in which the euro project was central, because otherwise this money would not come into the country. They are very... So we have the picture of this period, which Greece becomes part and parcel of this neoliberal project. It is successful, and in this respect, when the crisis arises, we have the shock therapy, which is a neoliberal agenda that is supposed to be implemented in an economy that has no neoliberal characteristics. That's the basic idea of the mnemonio and the policy and the Greek program. The idea is that we come in, the IMF and the European, in an economy which is some between an Eastern economy, kind of Latin America economy of the 1980s. And this becomes evident if we look at the initial studies and propositions of IMF. Take an example. You go to the IMF report and say privatization's target, 20% of GDP. And they have their experience from Eastern Europe and the Latin America, how to estimate this 20% of GDP. And they have a table which indicates that from the experience of IMF projects, similar programs in Latin America and Eastern Europe, on average, it is 20% privatizations. That's so scientific is the target set. And so they said 20% of our GDP, that is 50 billion euros privatizations. And I come to the shock therapy and why it failed as part of the solution. Now, when they came in, they did three things. A, the fiscal adjustment program of mnemonio is 20% of GDP within 5 years. That is the largest, the greatest ever fiscal adjustment used in a Western economy. Because it's a target where you have to have public expenditure cuts at a rate of 13% of GDP within a 4-year period, to be correct, and an increase of taxes 6, 5, 7% of our GDP, again within a 4 years period. So it's a fiscal adjustment program of impossible conditions. The idea was the budget deficit in 2009 was 14% of our GDP, and then we had, at the end of mnemonio, to have a surplus of 5%, which is an impossible target. That was one element. The second element was straightforward, a 40% cut in wages and salaries, both in the private and the public sector. In order to attain this, a 40% cut in wages and salaries in the private sector, they did a number of things. They removed collective bargaining. You have to have your own private agreement with your entrepreneur, et cetera, but this was not enough. So they decided to end up with a very peculiar kind of intervention. The state will decide what the minimum wage will be in the private sector, which is, again, a new approach to how things, wages and salaries are. Okay. So we had this stabilization agenda. They started implementing it. The development agenda was supposed to come from privatizations and structural reforms. As I told you, privatization was set up at 20% of GDP. Then they started trying to find the state companies to privatize. They ended up in 4% of the GDP. And they have attained one privatization after 3 years. That is, they have less than 1% of our GDP. So the development agenda of the mnemonion was facing a fiscal adjustment program that was producing enormous recession, was unable to balance the whole thing. And the end result of this program by now is a 25% decline of GDP, the highest decline ever after 1929 within a 3 years period, 4 years period, and 27% of unemployment, up from 8% that was a few years. So it's a total collapse of the program. Obviously, this was supposed to keep paying the public debt. That was the idea. But the public debt, as all economists know, cannot be repaid through austerity and the decline and the recession. You either do inflation, you either do forgiveness of the part of the debt, or you produce growth. Through austerity, you cannot pay back the public debt. So we have already 3 times we have restructured the public debt. One by the PSI, private loans to Greece, private holders who are cut by 50%. Then we sent the Greek public debt all to be paid after 2020 until 2050, the 300 billion euros that we owe. So it was all sent back to the future. And then we had interest rates declined 3 times in the last 3 years, so we can pay less until 2020. Now, there is a 4th restructuring coming back. The public debt does not become viable, so the whole argument has nothing to do with reality. The austerity program and the Greek program is independent of the public debt question. This has become quite evident. Now, let's go to the 3rd element, which is what the left has been arguing all along. The left has been arguing all along that the Greek program has nothing to do with the public debt. It has proved quite right, and it continues to argue that in case we come to power, we'll renegotiate the public debt under any circumstances that will be viable, but we will not continue to pay back unless we get the economy back into growth. That's the basic idea. We'll stop paying back unless we... now, as you know, the Greek public debt is all in the hands now of the central banks of Europe and the central ECB, which has forgotten to pay back their gains, their profits through the Greek public debt. That's a detail. They will do it, I suppose. They gained something like 30, 40 billion euros out of the Greek public debt. Anyway, they will pay them back some time. The second element is get out of the austerity package and try to stabilize public expenditure, redistribute taxation in favor of the poor and against the rich guys that have to pay much more taxes. That's part of, as we call it, a left-wing agenda of austerity. You cannot change. It will be a kind of fiscal balanced thing, but it will redistribute the burden, the tax burden by the various classes. And finally, I will end up by saying that within this framework of the European framework, things are very tight. You can hardly think in terms of a break with the policies. The national policies, no matter how favorable they are, and we have a whole package of favorable measures in favor of the poor, protects the poor and things like that, change public administration, protect the welfare state and so on and so forth, bring back collective bargaining, etc., etc. All our program and the national measures have certain limits within which they have to be pursued. Unless we have a break with the European policies, there is no way that we can find a way out of the crisis. When we come into government, we'll think what we're going to do.
I don't want the figure yet.
Okay.
You'll give me a 5-minute warning?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Okay. I'm going to put a figure up a bit later, but I don't want you to be distracted until I put it up. And I'm going to start with something slightly different. I admitted to someone here from University of Missouri, Kansas City, that I was in the States, 1959, there, went to an economics course and thought, my God, I mean, this stuff is completely trapped, where Wittgenstein and Russell were with logical atomism in the early 20s. All these algebraic truth functions which mirror reality, but have no relation to reality, such as perfect competition, limits to the size of firms, transition between equilibria. When I went up to Oxford, I studied history and political theory. And I'm very glad I did. I was later seduced into economics because I thought I ought to actually master this private language game that economists play with themselves. But I'm going to talk a bit, therefore, about modern German history, following some points made by Fabio, and relate this to Merkel and Thatcher. I had to deal with Thatcher in the House, not very often, but her problem, the problem for both of them, in my view, is that they're trained as scientists. Merkel is a physicist, Thatcher is a chemist. They think there are finite solutions to problems, like finite equations. Chaos theory would never occur to them. You know, a fractal turning, what do the rating agencies do? Are they really to blame? Until it was clear that Merkel would not support Greece, the rating agencies hadn't destabilized the Eurozone. And when Thatcher argued there is no alternative, she simply did not know that there were alternatives. Now, I think also there's, just to be a little controversial, there's psychology and history here. In Germany now enjoying a more hegemonic role, or I qualify that, one cannot talk about Germany, many Germans, and at varying levels of consciousness. I applaud Joschka Fischer saying it would be a tragedy if for the third time in a century Germany were to destroy Europe, even in this case without firing a shot. I applaud Sigmar Gabriel, who seems to have fallen out with Per Steinbrück, saying Deutschland muss bezahlen. One of the points I'm going to make when I've had my 5-minute warning is that Germany doesn't have to pay. This is a myth. It's partly a matter of Gestalt, which is a good German concept. Again, I'm not going to give a lecture on Wittgenstein, but when he shifted from that earlier view that you could devise propositions which reflect reality, in his philosophical investigations, he drew on Jastrow and the duck-rabbit figure in Jastrow. You know, what is it? Is it a duck? Is it a rabbit? The facts don't change. It's how you perceive it differs. And there's a problem here with a particular word in German and in Dutch. The word is Schuld. Schuld means both debt and guilt in both languages. And then there's another problem, Max Weber, the Protestant ethic. Now, I'm not even going to ask you to put up your hands and say whether you've read the Protestant ethic. I suspect there are a few dozen Germans, a few hundred Germans have read the Protestant ethic, but they've all heard the association of these two words, Protestant and ethic. And Weber argued that capitalism arose because of the Protestant ethic. And he was wrong. Capitalism, as Tawney and others have shown, capitalism rose in Italy. It was the Medici who realized that they could on-lend deposits and they could sidestep the Catholic ban on usury by the particular convenience that they happened to be popes. It was Venice, through trading and credit, developed credit. It was Catholic Flanders, as well as Protestant Netherlands, developed capitalism. But many German people really think that Southern Europeans are, I don't need to run into this, are are idle and wastrels, because of this misperception. Then there's also Melanie Klein. Now, some of you may know more about Klein than I do, though I've been catching up. Klein had three related concepts: displacement, denial, and projective identification. Germany, Merkel, Schäuble, are displacing the points earlier made that German exports, still some 60%, depend on the rest of the European Union. But they're denying that they are responsible for the crisis. Others are responsible for the crisis. And this is the first, now this is a hard point. Not hard to make, but it's hard. This, after the war, I worked very closely with Willy Brandt for many years. Willy was among those chancellors who did not say, it now is time for Germany to be recognized as a fully fledged democracy and to drop the association with the Holocaust and World War II. But there was a German historian, Fritz Fischer, who in the early 60s found not only that, as with the Hossbach Memorandum, Hitler had planned World War II, but that the German and Austrian chiefs of staff had actually planned World War I. It's there in the dual imperial archives. They didn't plan the timing, but they planned to respond to an event when it came. And the problem also is that this, at a deeper psychological level, and I'd be glad to have your reactions, this is the first time since World War II and the Holocaust that Germany has been able to project itself in terms of Schuld as guilt-free because in surplus, and the rest of Europe ridden with guilt because they're in deficit. Keynes also could be blamed. He foolishly, I know, you know, I've had one or two books published in other languages, and publishers say, please write a preface, please write a preface. God knows he should have slept on the preface he wrote to the General Theory in German. Because in it, he said, I've designed this book for liberal democracies, but I must admit that the policies could be more easily applied in a totalitarian state. Now, okay, so Keynes also partly to blame. Keynesian policies aren't going to work. Monetary easing isn't going to work. Low interest rates don't work. Keynes himself said, low interest rates alone, if there's a recession or a depression, will be no more effective than pushing on a piece of string. But now I think I probably should move to the figure. Or first, Delors. Delors. I knew Jacques Delors from the mid-70s. We both were on a committee of the Commission we were invited to study structural factors in inflation. And the end of the remit was, I'm working for ever closer union. I said, I'm not going to join a committee for working on ever closer union. What union? I'm not a federalist. I'm a confederalist. But anyway, they dropped that, and I met Delors, and we produced a report which the Commission banned on structural factors in inflation. Delors, I'll give you a clue about the nature of the committee. There were just 6 of us. Delors waited until the rest of us spoke and then said, inflation has nothing to do with trades union bargaining power. Inflation is a symptom of capitalist disorder. So I thought, right, symptôme du désordre capitaliste. I said, right, maybe I can work with this man. And several years later, it was Andreas Papandreou who got the first revision of the Rome Treaty in the Single European Act, which committed the Union to 2 twin pillars, internal market and economic and social cohesion. It's not surprising that Angela Merkel hasn't read it. Delors appealed to me to help him devise financial instruments to achieve economic and social cohesion. And I said, you'll never get it by fiscal transfers. Thank you. You'll never get it by fiscal transfers. I didn't have to be in the Westminster Parliament to learn that. It just wasn't going to happen. but I said you can counterpart the deflationary debt and deficit conditions of Maastricht by a long-term social investment-led program based on the US New Deal. Chance, can somebody help me here?
Let's see what we have here.
Let's see. Can you deduct this from my 5 minutes?
Yeah, right.
Figure.
I can do it. Yeah,
Figure.
yeah, I know that. There we go. How about that?
Okay. This is a figure, it's a modified version of a figure that I first devised at a conference in Coimbra in 2003, whose title was Europe in Question and What to Do About It. It wasn't difficult to foresee these devastating deflationary effects. The case made here is based on the US New Deal, in that US Treasury borrowing doesn't count on the debt of its member states. It doesn't count on the debt of California or Delaware. So I argued that Europe should introduce a financial institution which could do the same. It could issue bonds which do not count on national debt. And my report to Delors was published a month before his white paper. The report actually set targets for European employment of up to 15 million jobs in 3 different ways. Increasing labor intensity of employment in the social sphere, which was actually adopted the following year by the Essen European Council, social negotiation of reduced working time, and job creation through the multiplier effects of social investments. A director of the European Investment Bank rang me up and said, Stuart, we've seen your report to the President, we've seen his recommendation of union bonds, and we see that you highlight that union bonds should not count on the national debt of member states. Analogy with the US New Deal. So I said, yes, fine. He said, well, perhaps he and maybe even you don't know that of the then 12 EU member states, only the Netherlands and the UK count borrowing from us, European Investment Bank, against national debt. Well, I certainly didn't know. And very few other people still now know that EIB borrowing is not counted on the debt, even now, of the UK. I briefed Gordon Brown, and for once he listened. It's a national decision whether you count European Investment Bank borrowing against national debt. And the other thing, in relation to one of the seminars, or 2 of them, that I went to this afternoon, what do we do with the banks? Outflank the banks. I mean, of course I'd like to bring the banks into public ownership. And it's a scandal that Gordon Brown brought Royal Bank of Scotland and others into public ownership and would not manage them in the public interest, but outflank them. The European Investment Bank is a public bank, multilateral bank, and it's a non-profit institution. And with Antonio Guterres, we managed to get the terms of reference of the EIB extended, as is somewhere on this figure, to invest in health, education, urban renewal, the environment, and support for small and medium firms. And Guterres' secretary said to me, when the 3 of us were meeting, he said, Stuart, urban renewal, we live in urban societies. Surely that could mean any kind of investment. And then added, which is presumably what you have in mind. And it was. And besides which, there is the environmental case for green investments. So, as in this figure, EIF bonds. Why EIF? I designed the European Investment Fund. It's now a sister institution of the European Investment Bank. It was supposed to issue bonds and never did because of opposition from Germany. But the European Investment Bank has run into difficulties since the crisis on co-financing. Its co-financing by member states and national institutions has been constrained by the crisis. But it quadrupled its investments between 1997, when the EIB got these new terms, social investment, environmental investment terms of reference. it quadrupled its investments until the onset of the crisis to 82 billions, which is not an insignificant figure, because the multipliers from investment are much higher than fiscal multipliers. They're up to 3. And that's the point made lower down. Yes, I see that. Thanks. So that I was invited to advise the ETUC, and they accepted the case that the EIF couldn't co-finance EIB investments, which are very dependent on pension funds, and attract global surpluses, which is a basic Keynesian case and where Keynes was right. And the evidence which Yanis Varoufakis and I have, for example, from pension funds, institutions, Bloomberg's and others, is that they would fund EIF bonds, E-bonds, E as in euro, for less than 2%. So when Merkel goes on and says, and Schäuble, you can't solve the problem by piling debt on debt, it depends which debt. If you pile debt on debt at 7% and you're in recession, it's suicidal. If you finance recovery through debt at 2%, when that recovery could achieve by 2020 sustained rates of growth enabling a massive fall in unemployment, it's sensible. And whether or not the German government will turn on that, I think remains to be seen. But on the economic, my final point, the Economic and Social Committee of the Union, not the Commission, that's employers and trade unions, invited me to advise them 2 years ago. And what is striking is that they accepted this case. The German employers supported it unanimously, including what really is needed for small and medium firms in the periphery, which is not more lending to strangle them with interest rates before they made any money. It's a venture capital. A European Union Venture Capital Fund, which was part of my original design for the European Investment Fund. And that is needed also by Germany. Because, for example, Italian venture capital is 1/6 that of Germany, and German venture capital, despite Mittelstandspolitik, is only 1/6 that of the United States. And these arguments convinced the German employers, and Philippe de Beck, who's the president of Business Europe, which is the employers' confederation. Am I optimistic? Not madly. Could the Eurozone disintegrate? Yes, very easily. Will Germany turn? Maybe, if there's a grand coalition including the SDP, but also only if the agenda is really made. There are feasible solutions. Germany does not have to pay. That you don't need fiscal transfers from Germany to fund European bonds. EIB bonds have been issued since 1958 with no national guarantees and no fiscal transfers. It's not a theoretical argument. It's reality of a certain kind. But with this Gestalt problem, Merkel and Schäuble don't see it that way. It's still debt as guilt, not credit as belief. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll just open it up to questions. It'll take about 5 or so questions at least to start. Looks like we have about 40 minutes if I'm reading my watch right. So, please. Okay, what? Oh, yeah.
I have several questions for Mr. Stathakis. I like your optimism that you will become government soon. But I think you have failed to identify some serious dilemmas that the left government will have to face in Greece, like as soon as you take up the governance. For example, you failed to identify some characteristics of the Greek economy at the macroeconomic level, some like fundamental characteristics. For example, the high levels of tax evasion, tax avoidance. And it's tax evasion and tax avoidance not only from, let's say, the capitalist class, but also from the middle classes, like the self-employed. It's reported, like doctors, lawyers, engineers. But it seems that the political strategy of Syriza so far is to accommodate these classes, these middle or high middle classes, and not really. You seem to be avoiding conflict. But if you do avoid conflict now, how are you going to deal with this issue when you take up the government? And also about the productivity of the Greek economy. It's reported that Greek workers work longer hours than any other workers in Europe, but the productivity levels are really low. And this, I guess, has to do also with the public sector, with corruption, with inefficiencies. Again, it seems in the political strategy of Syriza is to avoid conflicts or trying to accommodate everybody else but the political establishment. It's true that corruption comes from the old political establishment, but it has penetrated the public sector. The state apparatus is corrupted. Not as a unified whole, but there is corruption. How are you going to deal with this? And what else? Well, okay. And don't you find that? Do you think that there are no progressive elements in the memorandum? In the mnemonia, you seem to decline them, reject them as a whole, but there are some progressive elements there, like cuts in imprudent spending. Do you think this is progressive? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's a lot.
Back there. Yeah.
Sorry.
I would like to ask a question to the panel in general, actually. Everybody have in their presentation at some point referred to the enormous amount of German capital exports and German domination. But nobody referred to the term imperialism. Doesn't anybody think the term is relevant even when German capital domination is so obvious across EU?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last point.
Doesn't anybody think the term is relevant even when the German capital domination is so obvious across EU?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Way over. These two. Let's go this way. Well, I guess I'm going that way. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Here.
Two guys over there.
For the member of Syriza, sorry, I forgot your name. My question is, in case Germany says no to the renegotiation of the debt, is there any scenario, are there any thoughts about the scenario of leaving the euro, which is, in my case, the best scenario for Syriza? And for Mr. Stuart Holland, I have I would like, since you knew Jacques Delors, I would like to know whether the euro itself was like more a French imposition or a German imposition, and what if there was any fight about the composition of the eurozone itself, for instance, in the acceptance or not of Italy as a member, the 60% of debt as a criteria, which in my view was designed against Italy, who could not meet that criteria at that time. Which were the internal discussions of in Germany and the relations with France regarding the euro?
Yes. Over there.
US first.
Yeah, yes.
Just that one bit there.
Yeah.
And stop.
Question primarily for Stuart, but anyone who wants to respond. Much of the analysis of the problem with the neoliberal agenda from a political economy perspective would indicate that it is primarily structural and that the structure of capitalism requires this accumulation, and this is the only direction that can be expected. Stuart seemed to be suggesting that there might be alternative motivations for how we get into this in terms of some psychological causes for the decisions that are being made, and I wonder if you would comment on that.
If we talk about Gestalt, could Germany not use the same mechanisms which Stuart is proposing? Because the German model, if I'm good informed, is exporting more or less 60% of its GDP, and out of that, most of it are cars to the rest of the world and the rest of Europe. And everyone who's acquainted with Kondrachev knows that we are in the third or the fourth Kondrachev, and in the meantime we have the fifth or the sixth. And I have the impression that Germany missed the fifth and the sixth Kondrachev, and we have still old technology. So could they use your model if they, as a kind of gestalt in Germany, not only on wages, increase wages, but also with great investment projects on new energy sectors, new biotechnologies, etc. They could profit if they make a gestalt change, and the rest of you could have benefits from this multipliers as well. So perhaps we could combine the propositions made by Geert, increase of wages and investment land recovery in Germany itself. It's an outdated model. We are near the end of the oil. We have environmental and climate problems. Germany is not the future. We are back in time if we project this for the whole of Europe. And I like a response from Stuart and from other ones sitting there.
So we'll turn it over to the speakers. I do want to play the part of the shill in the audience. Fabio mentioned that if anyone was to ask him, he might comment on differences in the left in Germany on their interpretation of what to do when you were up here. And you also spoke 3 minutes short, stuff like that. So you might pick that up. We could post cover the question. Yeah. But, any particular order that people want to go in? Anyone choose to go first? If not, we'll. Okay, then we'll start in the same order you presented. Here, do you want to go first?
Capital, German capital domination. Yes, there is an important tension that we must not neglect. Yes, there is this capital domination. That's the north-south.
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone? Yeah, here. Is that on? Is that on? No.
There is a German capital domination, and well, we must not neglect it. But it's not just Germany, but Germany and its vassal states. But at the same time, it's also a matter of class relations, and I think we mustn't let ourselves be stuck in the state issue, because then we lose each other, and that's for me the most important point.
Fabio? Oh, yes. Faster down one that works. Yep. Is that turned on? No idea. This one's on. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. So I talked a lot about the hegemonial role of Germany, but certainly even other governments in Europe want structural reforms in their own countries. It's sometimes cozy to pinpoint at the memorandum, but they're certainly collaborating like right-wing or conservative governments, and they're interested in structural reforms because even they have capital, and even the capital in other countries tries to reposition itself within the value chain that is dominated by German capital. So I think this is an important point. Regarding the other aspects, because you said I should briefly touch upon the debates we had in the German left. So in the German left, we had the debate whether the right strategy to confront the crisis would be a great leap towards closer European integration, something that Minsky might have called big government, so as to have these kind of fiscal mechanisms like in the United States, and I'm more skeptical about that. For just to mention one reason, I think the problem with fiscal transfers, first of all, what we try to communicate to the German electorate is that they're not paying for the Greek worker or for the Spanish worker, they're paying for the banks, to make it briefly, because these debts that you have nicely touched upon with the analogy with Geert in the German language have to be repaid towards the banks. However, if, for example, I think the United States has a public budget of 24% of GDP. The German budget is roughly 13% of GDP. And if you would try to increase it, so you would have to double the size of the German public budget if you want some kind of fiscal mechanism to set off these trade imbalances. And I think this would, in economic and political terms, not be sustainable because, first of all, if you just continue business as usual, it would mean that you would have to convince German labor, which finances the bulk of the taxes, to first make wage sacrifices, which creates problems in Europe, and then to pay for continuing the business so that other countries can import. And I think this is politically not feasible, so you would rather create anti-European sentiments. I'm not talking against structural funds or big investment projects which might be financed via the ECB or the European Investment Bank. I'm not talking about against that, but I think we must focus on the issue of distribution. We must focus on the issue of tax justice, even in political terms. Otherwise, we would lose public support for this project. So this is why I'm very skeptical of this technical idea to rebuild something like the United States of Europe on the European level. I think it's a huge difference whether you have 27 nation states with different political systems, cultures, regions, and you cannot simply. This would be the same fallacy that that we accuse neoclassical economists of portraying some idealist world which is far removed from political realities.
Yeah. Okay, let me underline a simple fact. There is nothing in the Greek system of public expenditure that is different from the European average. We spend 10% on public administration, 11% on pensions, 8% on health, and another 10% in education and defense. We spend more on defense, less on education. But the basic structure is exactly the same. The same structure is also in the case of tax income. We have exactly the same structure of value-added tax, indirect taxation, etc., with one exception. We get 5% of our GDP, which is huge, a huge sum, because of the above-average tax evasion in Greece. On average, in EU, it was 10% of GDP, the tax evasion. In Greece, it was 20% for the last 15 years. And the basic root of this tax evasion had to do with the rich people, plus the professionals, lawyers, doctors, plus a large percentage of self-employed. So in our program, there is no question we will have to attack tax evasion because otherwise the system won't work. And it will not be just. On the other hand, we underline the fact that in the last 3 years, tax evasion has increased enormously to 30% of our GDP, which is crucial because it underlines the fact that while Mnemonio comes in and say we will produce tax justice, tax evasion has increased, so the increased tax burden goes to the other 70% who are paying already taxes. And it's the average waged Greek pays more taxes than any other European at this moment. Swedish included, Finnish included, who has got the highest rates. It's enormous, the tax burden bared on this. So one of the areas where Syriza has produced a very detailed program is the new tax system that we propose, because otherwise it won't work, the system. Secondly, public administration. As I indicated, I did not have time to. Public administration was allowed to decline as a system during the neoliberal era. Public administration was better back in the 80s, even better back in the 60s. It goes down the way it functions because of the neoliberal era and the way they thought that the state would function. So public administration reform is central to Syriza because we want to protect the welfare state and want the state to be back in the agenda, bring the state back in. So yes, we have to reform public administration in many crucial ways. What they are arguing that they will increase productivity through the reforms of the mnemonia, it's wrong. They are not reforming the state. They don't care. They are closing down the national broadcast. They are cutting off various bits and pieces in the public sector, but they are not reforming the system. Now, is there something positive in the mnemonion? There are certain elements, yes. The overspending of the medicines in Greece, it was 4% of the GDP. The average in Europe was 1%. There was a party going on there, obviously. Okay, it was positive. It has to be reduced. There is a progressive element in the fact that salaries and wages in the public sector came under a common payment scheme. Okay, that's better than the fragmented system we had in the past. But that's about it. All the rest is a very strict neoliberal agenda which is beyond any imagination. Now, Plan B, in case we fail to come to an agreement with our European friends. Merkel is the problem, let's put it plainly. There was a long debate among the Greek left whether to go for Plan A, as we argue in Syriza, remain in Euro and the Eurozone, and try to change policies in Greece and Europe, or Plan B, go back to the drachma. Second view is also present in Syriza. It's a minority, but still present. Yet what has come, everybody has come to agree, is that Plan B has to do with a new agreement with the European partners to leave the euro on an agreed base, so that you can devalue, but then you need European money to support your banking system and the new currency for at least 3 to 5 years. This became evident in Cyprus as well. So the idea of getting out of the euro on a unilateral base is not in the debate anymore. What is still going on as a discussion is what Akel did in Cyprus, said, okay, we have to agree to go back to our national currency, but will be a period of 3 to 5 years when there will be an agreement with the European Central Bank and the European partners, so they will support the new currency for quite a number of years. That's a version of Plan B that is still around. Personally, I'm very much against it.
Stuart?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I won't take the points in the order they were raised, because I think the first point relates to the third and the fourth. What happened to Maastricht? I wasn't at Maastricht, but it's pretty clear that it is clear, and I think well known, that Kohl's ambition was to lock Germany into Europe. Whereas, of course, what we've now got is Europe locked into Germany. And that is, yes, that is imperialism. But it dare not speak its name. It's ein nervöser Wort, Imperialismus. Nobody, well, apart from critics on the left, would use that vocabulary. But what happened was that it appears there was a meeting between Mitterrand and Andreotti. No one was getting anywhere. The 3% deficit and 60% debt criterion were not the basis of an econometric analysis. There was none. when it appeared that the proposal for single currency wasn't moving and Kohl wanted it, Mitterrand and Andreotti met and, with their advisors, decided, well, look, let's just take the damn average that there's been in recent years and that'll be it. We've got to give Kohl a figure that he can go and argue with the Bundesbank. So that appears indeed to have been how it was. Structure of capitalism, role of psychology, and then the other point, could Germany shift its Gestalt, not least because its own growth model is outdated? I'm very sympathetic to that. I remember the debate in the SPD with in the 70s was on Investitionslenkung, investment coordination. And some of those concerned, like Norbert Wittjoek and others, realized that Germany is a modern economy. I mean, it's like, I'll give an analogy. When I was in the States, in Kansas City, there was a very attractive young woman whose father had a Ford, whatever it was, Thunderbird, or something of this kind. And I was told, can you use a stick? Change the gears. Well, yeah, I'd never used anything else. So I shifted it into what I thought was, it was on the level, what I thought was first gear. Well, I thought, well, it's supposed to be a powerful car. It started rather slowly. It started in top gear, yes? I mean, there were so many cylinders that all you had to do was touch the gas pedal and off the thing went. And this is pretty well true of the German economy. But these are modern, not advanced technology sectors. Where is the innovative German computer company? There isn't one. You know, Nokia's having a lot of trouble at the moment, but at least Nokia developed by, you know, Nokia used to be a state timber company. It was their timber and rubber, made rubber boots. Then when General Telephone Systems were introduced in Finland, because it was quite well managed, it was asked to do the general phones, you know, the ones with fixed lines. Then it had entrepreneurial leadership and went into mobile. And then the Scandinavian countries networked, their governments networked. It was Nokia designed 3G. The Scandinavian countries endorsed it. And because of that, these small countries were able to set the European agenda. But this was through the state, yes, not private enterprise. Germany's got a very serious problem, I think. On the matter of could Germany shift its Gestalt? Well, I've just had this experience with the German employers on the Economic and Social Committee. And there was one of them fought in the Second World War. He was conscripted in 44, 45. You might know his name. It's not quite Friedrichs or Friedrichs. So he's about 90. And when I made the case that the bonds need not count on German national debt, there need not be fiscal transfers. You've got the EIB precedent. The EIB is already more than 3 times the size of the World Bank. And that it the bonds, EIF bonds, could finance a European venture capital fund. He was sitting in the front and he said, richtig, ganz richtig, wichtig, wichtig. And then he got up and embraced me. You know, so I mean, can Germans see the issue the other way? Yes, I think they can. What I lament is that we haven't had a seminar. Friedrich Ebert will probably do one in November, but that's after the September elections. We haven't managed to have a seminar in Berlin with the German trade unions and employers before September. If that could be organized, I think it would be a good idea, and Friedrichs would come along.
Okay, I'll start off with at least the 2 hands that I saw before, yours and who was the other one that was up before? Yeah, the 2 of you. We'll see how far we get.
Thank you. I'm Frédéric Bocara from France and from Economist Atterré and from European Progressive Economist Networks. My question is about European Central Bank and proposals. We know more or less at the European level the needs, and all of those of you with differences spoke about the necessity of developing productive system all around Europe as solution to imbalances, to wages and to social demand, but I would insist also to develop public services, which is another kind. And we need for that new spendings. And Stuart Holland spoke very well about the need of debt credit. I agree. But I do not know. The question of another euro is in the core of that question as an alternative. Not going out of the euro, not keeping the things, but another kind of euro as an alternative. Because with the huge amount we need, I would not be agree to say we will have normal bonds, I mean bonds on financial markets. We need monetary creation of European Central Bank. So it leads to some struggle with European Central Bank. And for chance, people in the streets, they got the prompter, as my friends say. They speak about Troika and European Central Bank. So they have less knowledge than us, but they know that European Central Bank is at the center of the question. So, and if we speak about rules and the idea of to respect rules, European Central Bank give 1,000 billion of euro to European Central Bank, give it to the banks with no conditions. And to the states with antisocial condition. So let's speak about conditionality. But so that question of unified struggles towards the question of financing of public services and another financing of banks by European Central Bank, for me is crucial, even in the case of national question. I work on that with economists of Syriza, Izquierda Unida, Die Linke, Birnbaum, Yanis Milos, and others. So, but there is a high question, and we propose not exactly European Investment Bank, but a new European fund. Because we need not only investment, infrastructure, material, and that is the difference between the era of Keynes, but we need wages, training, financing, training, or education, it is wages. So maybe we need another institution, but I would like to know how the question of another euro isn't or not at the center of the alternative.
What's your first name?
Frederick, not Paul.
Frederick.
Back there.
It's my father.
Back there. Back there.
Which one?
I have a quick question regarding the fact that indeed all the bailouts are to repay the banks, and if you look at all the figures which we tried to find out, is especially the German and the French banks. I mean, you said it then, but the fact is, what would happen if these banks would not be repaid? And don't forget, there's a whole issue of the credit default swap markets behind it. I mean, I'm not going to talk about it, but what, is that feasible? Is that an option? And the second thing, Merkel is obsessed by competitiveness, coming from her experience of Eastern Europe. And what is the response? I mean, the alternative proposals we've just heard is kind of response, but what is the response in Germany or from the left to her obsession?
We'll take that as the last question.
Okay. So I have two questions. So the first is, what are, in your opinion, the political conditions for creating an international, or reinvigorating the international working class movement in Europe, and how to build international solidarity not only between Southern and Northern Europe? We saw last November that the attempt of a general strike didn't succeed. So how is it possible to build international solidarity also between Eastern and Western Europe, which was a topic that wasn't really addressed in the presentations? And then the second question is it possible for you to find a solution to the euro crisis just at the European level without questioning issues like imperialism, the transformations in the global political economy, and trying to link with social movements at the international level?
So we'll go in the same order. Yeah, first reply on the... Yeah. Okay. Is this okay? I first reply on Frederick Bucker. That's a very important question. There's absolutely no doubt for me that the thing to do in the current situation would be government public spending, financed by ECB bonds, government bonds financed by the ECB. However, that is in the current political situation, that is an illusion. In the current political situation, that is an illusion. There is no left majority in the European Union. There's no left majority in the in the Euro countries. It is an illusion to believe that within the next 2 years or so, when we need it most, there will be this government spending. That it must be done, but it's an illusion. So and therefore I think that in the current situation, it's labor that must. So we can't expect it from the governments. So labor must unite. So the second best alternative is increasing wages in the countries where you have surpluses. Okay.
Fabio? Pass down either one, they both work.
So two very important points were raised, and this gives me the opportunity to touch on two other controversies we had in the league. First of all, I think this is a very crucial point. Even if labor must lead the expansion, labor will not lead the expansion when it's with its back against the wall, because you have to push through higher wages. So I think the role of public investment is very crucial, and even us, Die Linke, argued for monetizing government debt. This is forbidden in the European Constitution according to Article 123. But now I'm getting precise. There's a loophole that you could take some public bank like the EIB, and which is allowed to refinance itself by the ECB, and you could achieve the same purpose. However, in political terms, I'm also very skeptical. There was I think it was a Tory, Sir Alan Batt, who once commented on the monetary policy under the Thatcher government, and he said he doesn't think that it was anyone's intention to confront inflation in the UK. It was the intention of the central bank to to break the backbone of the labor movement. And so we have to see that even the ECB is a highly political institution, even if it portrays itself as being independent or whatever. And so this is rather a question of whether we will be able to push through these reforms via the institutions, and this would fill a whole another evening. I'm skeptical of this, but I think the political point, the economic point is justified. There's no other way around against than monetizing government debt to a certain degree. And now to the second point concerning the bailout. Certainly is it true that if you would just let all the banks go bust, you would have a financial meltdown. It would be catastrophic. There's no doubt about that. So even when we had the bailout of the HRE, one of the larger banks in Germany, the position of the left was always yes, if it's of systemic relevance, too big to fail, then we will certainly support some bailout, but we want to manage the bank in the public interest. And because it was clear that it will not be managed in the public interest, we rejected the bailout. On the European level, there was also a debate within the Linke because liabilities are even assets, and whether you should not even increase the European Stability Mechanism. I'm skeptical on that because I think certainly we need a partial deleveraging and even scaling down the financial sector. And by the ESM, you will not achieve control and management of the banks, so it's rather an unconditional bailout. And this is why we always argued that we should only bail out those functions of banks, like mass deposits and so on, which are crucial for the functioning of the economy. But we should also organize in some controlled manner, paralleled by ECB interventions and so on, write-downs of debt, but this was also disputed within the Linke. So some people argue that certainly under the current conditions, without ECB support and in an uncontrolled fashion, letting like write-downs of debts could lead to spiraling of interest rates on government debts of Greece and other countries and so on. And so it all depends on the technical design, but in essence, I do not agree with the position that this is just, on the one hand, asset and liability, because you can see in Ireland that certainly serving the debts does even reduce the available income of workers who have to service the credit, and it reduces effective consumption. So I think there's no way around than to scale down the financial sector as well. And this is why I'm against unconditional bailouts via the ESM.
I'm not sure anything I say in response to Frederic is going to satisfy him, but there are 2 points here. What I've presented is what is feasible now, without any new institutions, without any treaty revisions, and that is the political pitch that I'm giving to it. What I would like to see is different. I'd like to see the ECB issuing bonds, yes, but it's not going to happen. I had a meeting with the ECB in December, and with allegedly what should be their A team, I was told not to mention names, but some of them are well known. They want growth. They actually want growth. They see it's not working, but they say governments have got to lead. Bonds are fiscal policy, that damn term fiscal policy, which means everything to everybody. You know, it can either mean taxation policy or whatever, public spending or bonds. They actually want it. They can't go very public on it because, you know, Jörg Asmussen is already appearing in Karlsruhe to respond to charges from Weidemann. So, but they are open to it. Now, I think that let me make a simpler point, not talk for the ECB. The concept that I put to Delors
and is endorsed by the Economic and Social Committee, is to Europeanize borrowing and investment, social borrowing and investment. That could from now be all social investment. All investment in health, in education, in urban renewal, etc., which would, funded by recycling of global surpluses, where, the Chinese Investment Corporation, for example, has been making losses in the private sector. It has declared that it wants long-term public investments. Standard & Poor has said you need growth. Bill Gross of PIMCO, 360 billions of funds, says in April we need growth. I think that if you shift all national investment in these broad areas to Europe, you release fiscal resources. It's not an immediate solution to the poverty question. I think that there could be a fund made by the profits that the ECB is basically making at the moment, which should fund an emergency social program. Even going back to the New Deal again, food stamps. Yes, I mean, people are, that could be done. But the key thing is think big, think at least up to 2020, shift national investment off the national public sector borrowing requirement to Europe. Briefly, we're running over past 7. Merkel's obsessed with competitiveness. Yes, I can agree with that. How to build solidarity? I'd like to think it would be a spontaneous mobilization of the working class across frontiers, but I think the way to build solidarity is to get Europe back to work and showing that a social agenda actually functions and can function well.
Okay, well, we are over, and so I want to thank our speakers. Is Susan here?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Oh, okay. So you know where the buses are? And
I know where the buses are.
All right.
Before we go to the buses, I would like to give you a little gift to remember when you've been speaking. We all appreciate very much your input.
Thank you.
I will give you.
Thank you.
Oh, excellent.
The buses, when we go to the outside. The buses are on the outside. So they're on the left.
Okay.
Is
Outside.
that any help to you?
Outside to the left.
Yes. Because we had,
Excellent.
we might talk over
Glad I
dinner.
finally got you here.
But I'm very close to Amato. And it's such a tragedy. He was the lead figure in the Italian press. Saccomanni, however, I said, can we, I'm skeptical, but can we get the case through to Letta and Saccomanni?
The problem is, I completely agree with that.
He put it with this figure and with a page and a bit to Saccomanni 3 weeks ago.